I'm Priscilla Barrera with the Investing News Network, and here with me today is Andrew Miller, Head of Price Assessment at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us again.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All right, so we just wrapped up the Anodes event here at the Benchmark Minerals Week. What are some of the main takeaways from the event?
I think there's a huge, a period of growth we're about to move into in the anode market. I think there's a few different views in terms of how that balance between natural and synthetic is really going to play out. But ultimately, I think, there's an acceptance now that there's going to be a blend of the two materials and both are going to experience some very significant growth over the next few years. I also thought a really, unique part of the event today was today and yesterday were the talks that we had from some of the new and up and coming anode producers as well, and actually the involvement here in the US in those new technologies. So that was very exciting to see, and I think it made for a more rounded discussion in the anode sector, which often gets overlooked and maybe doesn't get the attention it deserves.
All right, and yesterday in your presentation, you mentioned graphite will continue to be the dominant raw material. Are there any factors that could derail this story for graphite?
In our perspective, it will remain the dominant longer term. It would be, as I say, a blend of natural and synthetic. I think in terms of derailing, I think you're still going to see a huge amount of growth in graphite. Some people may be more aggressive in terms of the development of new technologies and some of the silicon or lithium-based anodes that could be used in the future. So those could challenge your natural and synthetic graphite. But I think, really when you look at the time to commercialization of a lot of these new technologies, particularly considering we're looking at using these type of materials in electric vehicles as a big growth market, there's a long lead time to really introduce those. So that's how we view things in our models at the moment. But I suppose, a more aggressive rollout, and you are starting to see some partnerships, and a lot of R&D and investment is going into some new technologies. So, that's the one area where when you look past that sort of 10-year time horizon, a lot could happen in the space.
All right, and we also talk a little bit about shortfalls in the natural graphite sector. Some market participants were talking about that not happening anytime soon. What is your perspective?
Well, I think you really have to look at the graphite sector. You can't look at it as a whole, and I think that is really difficult. If you look at the total market, you look at some of the excess in the market over the past few years, particularly for natural graphite. I think although it does reflect the prevailing market dynamics, when you look going forward, particularly with the growth of certain grades being used in these anode materials and that being your main area of growth, you actually see quite a different market dynamic emerging for different grades throughout the supply chain. So I would agree, and certainly in our models we don't see the market moving into a huge deficit for the flake concentrate. What you really have to look at what's the battery ready graphite, that's going into the supply chain, and how is that going through, whether it be the spherical processing, the purification, the graphitization, and where are the bottlenecks along that supply chain.
All right, and yesterday you also mentioned that we haven't seen as many partnerships happen in the anode side as much as we've seen in the cathode sector. Why is that? And do you expect to see more of that looking forward?
Yeah, I think, you haven't seen the price volatility for one thing particularly on the raw materials that go into the anode compared to the cathode. Also, the cathode is a bigger proportion of the total cost. So as people have been looking along the supply chain, those have been the areas that have drawn the attention of the EV manufacturers and battery cell producers. I think we are at a turning point now for anode, and as I was mentioning, with the turnout that we've seen over the past couple of days, you see the interest from along the supply chain in anodes that certainly wasn't the case 2-3 years ago, and I think there's the appreciation that a lot more can be done at an anode level. So I think you're going to see more partnerships, you're going to see more downstream companies looking to take a greater hold in terms of what their technology is, what is the blend of materials going into their anodes, and how can they maximize the capabilities of those anodes in their applications. So a lot more to happen on the anode side, and we've seen over the past 12-18 months a huge amount of development on the cathode side. I think when we look at what's going to happen in the anodes, I think you could see a similar trend over the next 1 or 2 years for anodes as well.
All right, and then moving towards the cathode side, the cathode event is about to start. Let's talk about lithium and the question everybody's asking, are we at the bottom for prices in lithium? And if not, how long are we going to stay here?
I think we're certainly close to the bottom. Where we are with lithium, you really have to look at a lot of what's happened this year has been driven by the excess capacities at a feedstock level. So you have to look at the dynamics in that part of the market. I do think going into next year, we're not expecting any major uptick from where we are at the moment, but I do think you can't, particularly the prices you're seeing in China, and you look at the existing cost structure in the industry, and I don't think you're going to see too much more. There will be a stabilization of prices going into the new year. And then I think coming towards the second half of next year, you're going to see some improvement in those pricings.
Now, it's definitely been a challenging year, tough year in 2019. Do you expect demand to pick up in 2020? Where do you see the market going next year?
I think you're going to continue to see demand growth for lithium, and I think that's often something that gets overlooked. Maybe it's not where people were hoping it would be this year or compared to previous years, but you're still going to see demand growth. There is going to be greater consumption in the battery market. It's just where the prevailing market balance is once those orders have come through. So I think, looking into next year, as we've always said in our models, you're really looking at 2021, 2022, when you start to see some significant increases in the order volume. So I think in the second half of next year, obviously people preparing their supply chains, and you will see that gradual growth. I think the big thing this year is obviously, and what's taken quite a significant hit on the market, has obviously been the reduction in Chinese subsidies. And although people knew that were coming, that they didn't quite see how it was going to impact the Chinese market. Obviously, with those subsidies coming to a complete end at the end of next year, you could see some more dampening in that sort of outlook for the Chinese industry. But I think a lot of that has now been incorporated in, and people know the direction of that industry now. And there's a huge amount of growth coming now outside of China on the horizon that's going to eventually, provide some significant sources of demand growth as well. So I think there's going to be as we've always said, this year and into next year, I think you're going to be a transition time in the industry. You see the introduction of this new supply, and we're not quite where we're going to be by the mid-2020s in terms of the volumes that are being, in terms of demand. But I think there is, we're going to see the second half of next year, things pick up, certainly. And as I say, maybe not a huge uptick in pricing, but I think you're going to see a more solid market, and some of the discrepancies that have happened this year sort of iron themselves out.
All right. And another topic that we talk a lot about is investments in this space. And we saw some news recently about Pallinghurst and Traxys committing $2 billion into projects in the battery metal space. What do you think this means for the sector? And do you expect to see more of those type of partnerships going forward?
Yeah, I think certainly. I think you have two firms there that have shown a significant interest in the battery supply chain, and now working together to help develop further supply and further companies. I think it's a really positive thing in terms of drawing investment into the market, and that's something that is increasingly needed when you look at the time horizon to bring some of these new projects into the market. And as I was saying, when we're expecting to start to see really increased volumes ordered in the market, then I think you're going to need that investment to come in the next year, 2 years, and these type of partnerships will help push that along. And as I say, hopefully lead us in the right direction in terms of investment in some of these new projects.
All right. And did anything disappointed you in the lithium space in 2019? Did something that you were expecting to happen didn't happen?
Everything we say at Benchmark always happens. No, I don't think. I think one really interesting trend in lithium, actually more on the downstream side of things, I think has been the re-emergence of LFP cathode technologies, and obviously we were always a bit more on the conservative side in terms of the adoption of high nickel, and I think that's really played out. But LFP you've definitely seen some growth that maybe you weren't looking at sort of middle of last year. We weren't expecting to see that type of growth in the LFP market, but obviously a lot of, particularly in the Chinese market, that capacity has been directed towards low-cost, reliable chemistries, and that's been an interesting one for this year, I think.
All right, and looking ahead to 2020, what factors should investors pay attention to that could impact the lithium space?
I think you really have to look at where you look in the short term is really how long does it take for this backlog of feedstock supply to work itself out and feed through to the market. As I say, we've seen some of the projects, the spodumene projects, cut back or delay what they were aiming to do, and I think that will help ease those pressures on a feedstock level. But there's still a bit of a backlog in that part of the supply chain, and really the critical thing for especially feedstocks, spodumene pricing, but also for ultimately the chemical pricing as well, is where that price stabilizes and how that market balance really works itself out into next year.
Right, and my last question for you today, and we're asking this to many people here at the event. If you had to define what you expect will happen in the next decade in one word, what would it be and why?
It's a tough one. Yeah, a whole decade. I suppose it's quite a boring one, but revolutionary, I think. I think there's a huge amount of change you're going to see over the next year. We're just entering this period. A lot of people get hung up on what's maybe happened this year in terms of demand growth and how that might not have lived up to what people were hoping. But I think we're just in the first phase of what's going to be a huge transformational industry globally. As I say, we've seen parts of that in China. The rest of the world is playing catch up, and you're going to see the impact at an auto level, at a battery cell production level, and where that's happening around the world, and also for these raw materials that we focus on. I think a huge period of change is ahead.
All right, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Right, once again, I'm Priscilla Barrera with the Investing News Network, and here with me today is Andrew Miller, Head of Price Assessment at Benchmark Mineral Intelligence.